So, here are two poems. One is by Emily Dickinson, one is by ChatGPT 3.5 in the style of Emily Dickinson. Here is the first poem. A bird came down the walk and hopped along the grass. I watched it with a gentle talk and felt the world a mass. Its feathers were a vibrant hue, its eyes as bright as morn. I wondered if it ever knew how much its life was born. For in that moment I did see the wonder of all things, the world that hums with mystery, and all that it brings. And here is the second poem. There is a quiet hush that falls when evening shades draw near, a stillness in the air that calls to those who pause to hear. The world around us fades away as darkness takes its hold, and in this moment we may pray or simply sit and fold. For in this hush we may find peace and let our worries go, and in the silence we release all that we cannot know. So let us cherish this brief calm, this pause before the night, and let our hearts be free from harm as we await the light. Yeah, so if it wasn't clear, the second poem is the one Dickinson truly authored. There are a few ways we can tell. For one, it's pretty clear that the first poem is just rhyming for the sake of it rather than trying to make any sense or impact with its rhymes. What's more, while this isn't always a hard and fast rule, you can identify a lot of Emily Dickinson poems by the rhythm. I talked about this a long time ago in my song lyrics video, but most Dickinson poems are written in common meter. That is, 4 lines alternating between iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter. Basically, if a poem is written in common meter, you can sing it to the tune of Amazing Grace, I'd Like to Buy the World a Coke, or the Pokemon theme song. And as I said, it's not true of every Dickinson poem, but it's a quick way to potentially identify one of hers. Since the rhythm on the first line of this poem is off, we can tell it's AI. So there you have it, AI and not AI. Okay, I lied. Both of these poems are AI generated. These two poems come from a recent study titled AI Generated Poetry is Indistinguishable from Human Written Poetry and is Rated More Favorably by Brian Porter and Edouard Mathury. This study caused quite a hullabaloo when Scientific Reports published it on November 14th, 2024. You possibly even saw some of the discourse around this piece. There were a lot of headlines about it. And understandably, no? If readers like AI poetry more than human poetry, why should we even bother writing poetry anymore? But the implications of a study like this go even further. As Jen Benka wrote for LitHub, reports like these can reinforce what some argue is the art form's irrelevance, which in turn helps fuel arguments that discredit the importance of teaching poetry and supporting today's thousands of passionate and prolific poets, as well as the hundreds of nonprofit poetry organizations and publishers dedicated to their work. So, is poetry dead? Have the machines become the greatest poets of our day? Let's find out. If you couldn't tell, I have several thoughts on the matter. First, let's understand what actually happened in the study as the study explains it. Porter and Mathury claim that readers couldn't distinguish AI poems from human-written poems, and that readers favored AI poems more. They reached these conclusions by way of 2 different experiments. The first study pulled 5 poems from 10 famous poets: Chaucer, Shakespeare, Samuel Butler, Lord Byron, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, T.S. Eliot, Sylvia Plath, Allen Ginsberg, and Dorothy Lasky. Then, Porter and Mathury pulled 5 poems from GPT 3.5 in the style of each author. Notably, they just used the first 5 that ChatGPT produced, with no fine-tuning or input. The prompt was simply, write a short poem in the style of X poet, and they did that 5 times for each poet according to their results. In this experiment, 1,634 participants were each assigned to one of the 10 poets and read the 5 real poems and the 5 machine-written poems of that author. They had to determine whether the poems were written by a human or AI. In the second experiment, 696 new participants each received 10 of the 100 poems from the first experiment. Notably, all 696 participants received the same 10 poems, 5 real and 5 AI. Participants were asked to assess these 10 poems based on some given qualitative dimensions. Each participant was either told that the poems were all AI generated, all human written, or told nothing at all. For the group that was told nothing, they were asked to share whether they thought the poems might be AI generated at the end of the study. In the results for the first experiment, the authors wrote, participants were more likely to guess that AI-generated poems were written by humans than they were for actual human-written poems. The 5 poems with the lowest rates of human ratings were all written by actual human poets. 4 of the 5 poems with the highest rates of human ratings were generated by AI. Being written by a human poet decreased the likelihood that a participant would respond that the poem was written by a human poet. The odds that a human-written poem is judged to be human-written are roughly 75% that of an AI-generated poem being judged human-authored. As for the second experiment, quote, Study 2 finds that participants consistently rate AI-generated poetry more highly than the poetry of well-known human poets across a variety of factors. Regardless of a poem's actual authorship, participants consistently rate poems more highly when told that a poem is written by a human poet, as compared to being told that a poem was generated by AI. So, how did this happen? Well, Porter and Matry have their theories. Here are 2 quotes from the study, one from the abstract and one from a section titled Perception and Preference in Poetry: Biases Toward AI-Generated Poems. Our findings suggest that participants employed shared yet flawed heuristics to differentiate AI from human poetry. The simplicity of AI-generated poems may be easier for non-experts to understand, leading them to prefer AI-generated poetry and misinterpret the complexity of human poems as incoherence generated by AI. Non-expert poetry readers prefer the more accessible AI-generated poetry, which communicate emotions, ideas, and themes in more direct and easy-to-understand language, but expect AI-generated poetry to be worse. They therefore mistakenly interpret their own preference for a poem as evidence that it is human-written. Keep in mind, these are suppositions based on the study's results, but these suppositions do more or less make sense. In the study's discussion, the authors also wrote, in our discrimination study, participants use variations of the phrase doesn't make sense for human-authored poems more often than they do for AI-generated poems when explaining their discrimination responses. How many times have you looked at a poem and thought, this doesn't make sense? Especially in school, right? I talked about this in my Rupee Kaur video. Public schools tend to leave readers with the impression that poetry is difficult to understand and unrewarding to read. As the study's authors explain, poetry is a particularly difficult literary genre to understand and interpret, especially for non-experts. It incorporates a degree of arbitrariness since there are no strict or universal rules for what is acceptable or not, and it not only resists commonly acceptable meaning, but also reverses it. Now, I agree that poetry can be difficult to understand and interpret, and yes, nowadays English poetry can be pretty much whatever we want it to be, but I don't know if I agree that poetry resists commonly acceptable meaning or reverses it. Maybe I'm just misunderstanding what's meant by that phrase, but I certainly don't think poets are trying to trick readers. Here are some figures included in the study that illustrate the participants' enjoyment of the poems. As you can see, the only metric where human poetry measured up to AI poetry was originality. In everything else, AI came out on top. So it all sounds very cut and dry. And yet, the study had its limitations. As Benka wrote for LitHub, the group of poets included in the study share similarities. All of them are white, 7 were born before or in the 19th century, and in addition to reflecting the vernacular of their day, each has a notably distinct style that could aid in machine mimicry and false positives. Oddly, the poet Dorothy Lasky, the only living poet whose poems are included in the experiment, does not even appear on the site Porter and Matry name as their only source for the poems. I couldn't help but notice some limitations of my own. For one thing, the study used non-expert readers, but I couldn't find how the authors defined non-expert within the study. What does that mean? How do we categorize these study participants? I also have a problem with the second study using the same 10 poems for every participant. I understand that the study authors could only do so much with their resources. But personally, I think more conclusive results would come from a wider sample of human and AI written poems. Granted, I'm not a statistician or scientist by any means, but ultimately I had to put my money where my mouth was. I decided to do the Emily Dickinson portion of the study, and I correctly identified 8 out of 10 poems. I thought this one here was AI. My river runs to thee, blue sea wilt welcome me? My river waits reply, O sea, look graciously. I'll fetch thee brooks from spotted nooks. Say sea, take me. In hindsight, it was really silly of me to think this was AI. None of the AI poems, stylistically, look like Dickinson's, especially these dashes. Curiously, AI will never do that sort of thing since it's not really part of predictive text. So what led me to think this was AI? Well, in part, the phrase, "wilt welcome me," sounded inhuman. Shouldn't it be, "wilt thou welcome me"? Moreover, I just didn't really like the poem that much, even though I generally love Dickinson. So since I figured I would actually like a Dickinson poem, I said this one was AI. I thought the second stanza was the only one that really sounded like her. Here was the other poem I got wrong. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, and sings the tune without the words, and never stops at all. It flutters in the darkest hours, and lifts the heart up high. And though the storm may rage and roar, it never seems to die. For in the heart of every dream there beats a hope that's true, a light that shines through every seam and carries us anew. So let us hold on to this thing, this feathered hope so dear, and let it spread its graceful wing to chase away all fear. You might be familiar with this poem. Hope is the thing with feathers is one of Dickinson's most famous. So how did I get this wrong? Well, the thing is, this actually isn't Hope is the thing with feathers. Sort of. If you ask me, AI was totally cheating here because the first stanza is entirely real, but the following stanzas are all ChatGPT. It completely stole the first stanza from Dickinson, then made up the rest. Of course, some of you might have already known that AI was capable of this kind of theft. The other day, I made a post in my community tab that compared a fake Lord Byron poem to a real one, both of them used in the study. The first poem read, "She walks in beauty like the night, a vision of grace, a pure delight. With every step, a poem in motion, a sight to behold, a heart's devotion." The second poem read, "The beginning of eternity, the end of time and space, the beginning of every end, and the end of every place." Many of you correctly identified the first poem as AI, but that initial phrase clearly struck a chord with a lot of commenters, whether for better or for worse. "She walks in beauty like the night" is a real phrase that Byron uses to start one of his poems, so again we see AI just stealing directly from authors. The second poem here is missing some vital context, the title. This poem is titled "A Riddle on the Letter E." I would understand how, without that title, you might think it could be AI generated, as it seems perhaps too broad and without focus. Some folks also pointed out that time and space felt too modern as a phrase, which is kind of funny but also understandable. Shortly after making that community post, I did a miniature version of this study with my patrons, and a few of them also got tripped up by AI's propensity to steal. Doing that little quiz with my patrons was actually really informative. One of my patrons opined that a study like this wasn't truly all that informative about whether readers could tell AI poetry from human-written poetry. It wasn't as simple as, was this written by a human or a robot? The question was instead, was this written by one specific person, or was it written by a robot pretending to be that person? Another patron admitted that all the poems felt rather boring, whether written by AI or by a human. They didn't really have a preference between either set, which was interesting to me. Since I had the quiz handy, I decided to reach out to someone who really knows their stuff about writing.
Oh, hi. I'm Satara. I run a little website for writers called School of Plot, where I just post sort of updates about how my writing journey is going, as well as any research that I think would be helpful to other people who are on their writing journeys with me. Honestly, my experience with poetry is very, very limited. I am a consumer, but not a writer of poetry.
But despite being a little unfamiliar with writing poetry, Satara was pretty well versed when it came to poetic features. Perhaps more substantially, she was very familiar with ChatGPT's many tells. Satara did a similar sort of quiz with her Instagram audience and found that AI was not free from certain patterns. When looking at the real and AI Shakespeare poems, Satara noted,
Okay, so I feel like ChatGPT, it's very rigid and regimented with its way of writing. I think anyway, like I don't believe ChatGPT would end a line with R. I mean, ChatGPT loves a simile, I feel. Um, but the thing with ChatGPT similes is that they often mean very little and they're quite empty. Another thing that ChatGPT loves is a very structured rhyme scheme, I would say. I feel like in a lot of ChatGPT content, it's not this specific in terms of experiences. It sort of speaks to more sort of broad strokes, I think.
That last point in particular was an extremely good indication of AI written text. Unless you give ChatGPT a specific subject, it will almost always default to really broad topics and emotions. In fact, ChatGPT's poems are often so broad that it's sort of hard to parse messages from them.
It's exactly how my boyfriend describes the food that I eat, which is calorie dense, nutritionally empty.
Meanwhile, a lot of human poems are far more zoomed in than you might expect. While looking at this real Walt Whitman poem about a spider, Satara said,
Something I've noticed as a pattern in these is the ones that I've been thinking of ChatGPT sort of look at like this grand scale of things, like the stars and the mountain and life itself. And the ones that I think are real, especially this one, they sort of focus on a very specific moment or action, or I mean, this is just extremely specifically about a spider.
sometimes certain word choices on the human end would be enough to draw the line between machine and human. For example, this real Sylvia Plath poem uses the word cripples, and Satara noted that LLMs were usually designed to avoid potentially controversial words like that. Similarly, there was this real poem from Walt Whitman, O Me, O Life, wherein Whitman writes, "Of the empty and useless years of the rest, with the rest me intertwined." Satara felt that phrasing wasn't quote-unquote clean enough to be ChatGPT, especially with the immediate repetition of the word rest. She shared this anecdote.
Back when I used to work for a marketing agency and ChatGPT first came out, we were highly encouraged to use it as like a first draft for our pieces. And that was like one major thing that stuck out to me. We were working for like a boiler company, and ChatGPT would not put the word boiler into subsequent sentences.
It's actually kind of funny how ChatGPT tries so hard not to repeat itself these days. If you remember the last AI video I did, one of GPT's biggest weaknesses as a poet was that it repeated itself far too often and without purpose. With the Plath poems, Satara also pointed out that ChatGPT loves an AABB rhyme scheme. However, there was one Plath poem that tripped her up.
By my own logic, I'm confused because it is doing the AABV thing, but I don't think it would necessarily break that to go from soul to go. Because maybe I'm wrong, but I don't believe ChatGPT can make a creative choice like that.
Her reasoning was entirely sound. ChatGPT will almost never produce slant rhymes, and this was perhaps the most interesting rhyme it opted to use in all of the AI-generated poems. Satara also noticed that when AI tried to emulate certain authors, there were consistencies between those emulations. When looking at this fake poem in the style of T.S. Eliot, she said,
I'm gonna go with ChatGPT, and if I'm right, then ChatGPT, I think, really thinks that T.S. Eliot is like creeping around shadows in the city a lot, because one of the other poems that I said that about was just him creeping through a city as well.
Indeed, AI would draw on images that we might call cliched for each poet. The study's authors pointed this out too. In their discussion, they wrote, "In each of the 5 AI-generated poems used in the assessment study, the subject of the poem is fairly obvious. The Plath-style poem is about sadness, the Whitman-style poem is about the beauty of nature, the Lord Byron-style poem is about a woman who is beautiful and sad, etc. These poems rarely use complex metaphors. By contrast, the human-authored poems are less obvious. T.S. Eliot's The Boston Evening Transcript is a 1915 satire of a now defunct newspaper that compares the paper's readers to fields of corn and references the 17th century French moralist La Rochefoucauld. Out of the 36 poems, 18 real and 18 AI, Satara only miscategorized 3 of them. One was the AI Dickinson poem that stole its first stanza, one was the fake Plath poem that used the soul go rhyme, and one was this Walt Whitman poem from which she felt she could extract a concrete meaning. As for all of the human-written poems, she never categorized any of them as potentially AI-generated. But even though Satara scored quite well, she admitted that she didn't feel entirely confident with some of her guesses.
Honestly, in some of them, I was pretty much could go either way.
As far as how understanding correlated with authorship, I asked, do you think the poems that you had a harder time understanding, do you think that was an indication that a human probably wrote them?
Some of them I think I had a hard time understanding because there was nothing to understand. especially the ones where the plot, I guess, was like someone just thinking really hard about like the world and everything in it. I don't think I could have found a meaning in that. But yeah, some of them where I struggled, I always had an instinct that when I couldn't understand a poem, I felt like I had an instinct when it was because there was nothing there, and when it was just because I personally needed more time with it. But yeah, like I do accept that I'm not going to be able to get something from everything I read. But sometimes with the ChatGPT poems, I really do feel like it's because they were quite empty.
Satara noted that AI seems to have gotten better since doing her quiz with her Instagram followers in early 2024. In referring to the last time she messed around with AI, she said,
It also didn't take any risks in any way, in terms of like word choice, syntax, imagery, nothing. It was just, it is what it is.
That also felt very true of these poems. Barely a risk to be seen. Thanks a bunch to Satara for participating in this interview. Check out schoolofplaid.com and the School of Plaid Instagram page. If you like what I do here, you'll love everything Satara has to offer. Also, if you want to take this little AI versus human poetry quiz for yourself, it'll be linked down in the description. But in doing this quiz with my friends, one thing was clear above all else. This was not an enjoyable way to read poetry. Trying to tell whether a poem was human-written or AI-generated was far less interesting than simply taking in a poem on its own terms. There was another section of Porter and Matchery's results which gave me a sense of disagreement. When discussing what made human-written poetry appealing in its own right, they explain, indeed, this complexity and opacity is part of the poem's appeal. The poems reward in-depth study and analysis in a way that the AI-generated poetry may not. But because AI-generated poems do not have such complexity, they are better at unambiguously communicating an image, a mood, an emotion, or a theme to non-expert readers of poetry, who may not have the time or interest for the in-depth analysis demanded by the poetry of human poets. As a result, the more easily understood AI-generated poems are, on average, preferred by these readers, when in fact it is one of the hallmarks of human poetry that it does not lend itself to such easy and unambiguous interpretation. Okay, yes, human-written poems are often difficult to understand, but there's still something rewarding about reading a poem even without doing in-depth analysis, at least in my opinion. I agree with Jen Benka when she writes, "It's true that reading poems takes time. In fact, one of the art form's benefits is that it slows readers down and invites them to another place for a few moments. But it's not true that poems sweepingly demand in-depth analysis. Poems live outside of academic settings too. They roam free, ready to be engaged with and even enjoyed. Yes, poems ask for a reader's attention and collaboration, as all creative writing does. But that poems are all inherently difficult is a stereotype that scares readers away from a genre that might offer them personal insight, solace, and inspiration." As for why the more straightforward AI poems were more appealing to the study participants, Benka supposed, this could instead be something more fundamental, a confirmation of a desire to be led by a human guide, to be able to imagine the hand, to take comfort in another being, to know soul. I do want to highlight a few more observations from people who are smarter than I am. Deakin University's Andrew Dean, in writing for The Conversation, said, "In my view, the results of the study are less testaments to the quality of machine poetry than to the wider difficulty of giving life to poetry. It takes reading and rereading to experience what literary critic Derek Attridge has called the event of literature, where new possibilities of meaning and feeling open within us. In the most significant kinds of literary experiences, we feel pulled along by the work as we push ourselves through it." Meanwhile, Ernest Davis at New York University gave an expert opinion on ChatGPT's poems. Two things leap out in the collection. The first is the staggering banality of the poems that ChatGPT has produced. In the whole 50 poems, there is not a single thought or metaphor or phrase that is to any degree original or interesting, with one exception in Chaucer's third AI-generated poem. The other striking characteristic, particularly obvious if you look at the whole collection, and still more so if you have engaged with traditional formal features of poetry, either as reader or writer, is the extremely limited technical toolbox that ChatGPT uses. There is no significant use of alliteration or assonance. The vocabulary tends to be much easier than in the real poetry. There are no literary or historical allusions. Davis also highlighted AI's lack of creativity in rhyme scheme and meter. I always include my sources linked in the description of each video. For this video in particular, I'd really encourage you to check out all the sources, the study and its multiple responses. It was all very interesting to read. Lastly, let's hear a little from Dorothy Lasky, the only living poet included in the study. Lasky told the Washington Post, "Poetry will always be necessary. If these people in the study read AI poems and liked that poem better than a human-generated poem, then that, to me, is beautiful. They had a good experience with a poem, and I don't care who wrote it. I feel there is room for all poets, even robot poets." That is a surprisingly mature thing to say given the circumstances. Talk about wisdom. If there's one bit of hope we can glean from this study, it's the fact that humans want to give other humans a chance. Study participants demonstrated a bias against AI when they were told poems were written by AI. I'd like to think I'm a trusting reader. I don't immediately jump to the conclusion that something is AI generated if I have no reason to believe that it is. I think most people are trusting in that same way, but skeptical in the right forums. The fact that people show a bias against AI is great for human artists. But if folks can't tell the difference, what's to stop people from deceiving readers? I suppose the question becomes, how good are these AI detectors? Anecdotally, I've heard terrible stories of detectors getting it wrong, both when judging AI work and human work. If these detectors aren't so good, people could get away with almost anything at this point. I do worry that this whole ordeal is just going to embolden the plagiarizers of the world. It's possible that the authors of the study share my concern. In their discussion, they wrote, "Given people's difficulties identifying machine-written texts and their apparent trust that AI will not generate imitations of human experience, it may be worthwhile for governments to pursue regulations regarding transparency in the use of AI systems. The White House and the European Union have recently proposed regulations for disclosing the use of AI systems to generate texts and images. However, there is evidence that users often ignore such disclosures, so it is unclear to what extent such regulations can help. Identifying effective disclosure methods is a difficult but urgent question. Indeed, more regulation on AI would be appreciated, but in the meantime, the best we can do is keep writing human poetry and reading human poetry." Let's close on the real Emily Dickinson. "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, and sings the tune without the words, and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm, that could abash the little bird, that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land, and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me." If you liked this video, do all the things the algorithm likes. If you'd please, it helps out a lot. If you like what I do here on the whole, you can support me on Patreon. You're seeing the names of my patrons scrolling across the screen right now, and I really can't thank them enough. I'm so grateful for them and for how the community has grown over this year. Recently, we did a virtual poetry reading in our community Discord, and it was really awesome. If everything went according to plan, then I got this video done before the new year. If that's the case, I want to thank you all for supporting me this year, and I hope 2025 will be just as great. Ultimately, keep in mind, this is a rough draft.